Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and this podcast is brought to you by the Coaches Panel. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of Finders Keepers last week, where I went through my rankings of the best defenders likely to be available in your keeper league redrafts. This week, I have taken a look at the midfielders. The criteria is the same as last week. Any player who averaged less than 80 in 2024, and I haven't included any of the new draftees. I'm basing the ranks on a 30-man squad with 15 players kept year on year and using the standard on-field formation of 5 defenders, 7 midfielders, 1 ruck, and 5 forwards. And just like last week, there is a group of players who averaged under 80 last season, but I haven't included them in these rankings, simply because I don't believe they would be available in any leagues. And if they are, grab them as soon as you can. So who are these 5 unranked players? Stay tuned till the end and you'll find out. The midfield. The most important line in your fantasy side. It's where the bulk of your points will come from, and if you're in a league that plays with captains on, typically your captain is going to come from a midfielder. The midfielders in a keeper league redraft will generally be a mix of young players, not yet putting up fieldable scores, aged primos whose scoring is maybe on the decline, and players who have lost dual position status and with it their perceived fantasy relevance. I've put together a list of 30 midfielders ranked in order of how I see their importance and value in season 2025 and potentially beyond. Should we get into it? Yep, let's do it. Number 1, I've got a player who I almost didn't have on this list because I thought surely people will have held him, but I think there'd be just enough frustrated coaches out there who would have let this guy back into the pool. I'm talking about Adam Chera at Carlton, 25 years old, has sort of teased for a few years now. He's shown capable of being a 90s guy, but with that stacked Carlton midfield, I think question marks have come up over just how high his ceiling can be. And his 2024 season was just completely smashed by injuries, so it was hard for him to get any sort of continuity in the squad and with his scoring. But I think this is a big year for him, maybe the biggest of his career. Carlton need him to step up. I think he will. And if he's available, I'd be grabbing him. At number 2 is Jake Saligo from the Crows. He had a breakout last year, boosting his average up to 77, and that was thanks to a huge increase in his centre bounce attendances. So he became a really important part of the Crows midfield group, and his time on ground increased as the year went on. So another pre-season into him. He'll be fitter, he'll be running out games longer, and he's very much going to be a big part of the Crows midfield for a long time to come. Number 3 is another Crow, a new Crow, James Peatling, who made the move across to the Crows from GWS in the off-season. He really broke out in a sense last year for the Giants, but he was still used as the sub a lot. It's just that when he wasn't the sub, he scored really well, particularly when playing in the midfield. His average of 62 doesn't tell the story because he was used as a sub so many times last year. So in the games not sub-affected, his average goes up to 86. And I think at Adelaide, he's not going to be the sub. He's going to be one of their main mids. And I think he's going to score very well. Number 4 is another ex-Giant in Tanner Bruhn at the Cats. This will be his 3rd year with Geelong. And he's shown plenty of promise. He's been given opportunities in the midfield. The only thing that's hurt him, and certainly has hurt his scoring, is a combination of low time on ground and injuries, but not really long-term injuries, just little ones, concussion here or little things here and there have just stopped any momentum. So he's only 22. I think he's going to be a really good player for the Cats and in fantasy. He just needs to get more of a go with more time on ground. And I know that's going to be hard with Bailey Smith coming across, but I really believe in Bruhn. I think he's going to become a pretty solid 90s guy at worst in the future. Number 5 is Josh Ward at Hawthorn. Look, 12 months ago, he was all the talk. Everyone thought he was going to go up and, become a mini primo almost, but not sure what really happened. Hawthorn obviously really turned into a contender, which surprised a few, but Ward just found himself on the outside in the VFL, and then when he did play, it was mostly on a wing and just didn't have the role. He came in late in the year and played in, I think, a couple of their finals and really played well, which I think lends itself to him having a better 2025. And I just think if he's there, someone's given up on him, and I reckon he's worth jumping on, because I think it's just way too early to say he's not going to make it. I still think he is, and you're going to want to have him when he does. Number 6 is another ex-Giant and another new Crow. Isaac Cumming has come across as a free agent to the Crows. Now, he's 26, and a few years ago was really quite relevant in fantasy. He had a couple of really strong years where he averaged around 90, playing as that rebounding distributor for the Giants, taking in lots of kick-ins. But the last few years at the Giants, he was sort of pushed up to a wing, and he struggled with form, struggled with injuries, and he ended up averaging just 61 last year from just a handful of games. So do the Crows see him as a halfback guy or a winger? That's going to be really important to work out, because if he is a halfback guy, not only does he get those scores, I think he'll get those scores that he got a few years ago at the Giants, but he'll also pick up defender status, making him even more valuable for your side. Now, if he ends up on the wing, I still think he scores okay, but he is stuck as a mid only. So it's a bit of a tricky one. I personally think he is going to be more half-back. I think the Crows need a player in that role, and they've brought him across for that reason. But he will play wing, he will play a bit in the midfield, and if Miller is fit, that could probably hurt his chances of being the main guy off half-back. But either way, he's going to be a good scorer. The Crows got him for a reason, and definitely worth grabbing. Number 7 is Tom Powell from North Melbourne. He had a great year last year, broke out with a average score of 79. He's 22. The only thing with Powell is, and we saw it last year, they played him in a variety of different roles. On the ball looked really good for him. Then he went forward a bit and wasn't as good. And then he even had a stint at half-back. So I think North are trying to work out what he's going to be. I think with the injury to Wardlaw, they're going to get him back into the middle again. And I think half-back they got covered because of Caleb Daniels there, Fisher, McKercher. Yeah, I think Tom Powell, this is a really big year for him. I think he's going to be in the midfield, and I think he'd be quite a smart pickup, because there'd be coaches who had gotten a little frustrated with him over the years. Number 8 is a guy who he's really impressed since he debuted a couple of years ago. That's Ollie Hollands at Carlton. So before probably the last few rounds of last year, he was looking like being a really good runner, a good winger for Carlton, and probably not going to be on our fantasy radar for a few years yet. But late last year, they did give him a go in the halfback role. He's been training in that role. And as we know, Nick Newman, unfortunately, is out for the year. So at Carlton, there's an opportunity there, and I think he really fits the bill as a half-backer. So I think he's a real chance to get that role and score pretty well, and then, pick up defender status, which is always super handy. Number 9 is a guy that won a best and fairest very early in his career, and I think we all thought he was going to go on and be a fantasy star. And that's James Worpel at Hawthorn. Now, he certainly hasn't gone on to be a fantasy star, but I think even in his current scoring level, he's still pretty handy. He's always going to be in the middle. He's going to play every week, and he's pretty much going to score 80s at worst. So I don't think he's a terrible guy to have. He's only 25. He can put up a big score on his day, and I think he's pretty reliable as one of your last mids. So if he's still there, I'd be grabbing him. Number 10, and we have our first veteran, Steve Coniglio from the Giants. He's been a superstar in the past for our fantasy sides. And just when it looked like maybe his fantasy days were done, he had a really good 2023. Last year, not so good, averaging 77 and struggling with injuries. But he's 31. But I think with Cornelio, they're still going to need him to play a role in that midfield, and he can definitely still score when he's fit. The other thing that appeals about a guy like that sitting on the pool is he's the sort of guy that could finish his career with forward status. So even though his scoring won't be what it was in his heyday, he could be very handy down the track as a potential forward. Number 11 is a guy who lost his dual position status, which would have been devastating for owners and could potentially have lent to him being delisted. And that's Jason Burgoyne from Port Adelaide. He had a great breakout last year, averaging 77. He's 21. He really fits the bill of a guy you'd target in a keeper league. But losing defender status was a real bitter pill to swallow. I think we're all kind of hoping that he'd be like his dad, Peter Burgoyne, and absolutely carve it up off half-back. But he's found his home on a wing, which isn't the end of the world because he does still score pretty well off the wing. It just means the chances of him picking up that defender status is probably pretty unlikely. Still definitely a guy I'd be targeting. Number 12 is Matt Johnson at Fremantle. He's interesting. Him and Neil Erasmus were both sort of the guys set to break out in 2024. It just depended who got the spot on the field, and it was Johnson. He only averaged 62, but I think there's signs there that he's going to be a fantasy scorer in the future. Got a nice little sprinkle of CBAs, bit of time on a wing. I think they really like him. Not sure I'd have him on my field at this point, but I think for the future he's going to be a goer, and yeah, he's only 21 as well. Number 13, Cam Mackenzie at Hawthorn. So kind of similar to his teammate Josh Ward. 12 months ago, I think we were all thinking he was going to not break out, but he was a real fantasy stud, we thought. And it really just didn't happen in 2024. He didn't really get the role on the ball like we thought. Ended up averaging 59, spent a lot of time in the VFL. But I think similar to Ward is the fact that he didn't do it doesn't mean he's not going to do it. And he's been training pretty well. I mean, reports are every single player in the league's training well at this stage of pre-season. But I have read some pretty promising stuff on Mackenzie, and I reckon there'd be coaches who grabbed him last year and were burnt, meaning he could be yours. Number 14, we have another veteran, the absolute legend, Sam Docherty at Carlton. Now, before the pre-season, I didn't have too much interest in Docherty, other than him being a decent, half-decent scorer that could, be a depth guy. But with that injury to Nick Newman, there is a role there, an opportunity for Carlton to say, hey, let's get Docherty off the wing. Let's slot him back into that half-back role. Bit of experience back there. And anyone with any sort of memory knows Sam Docherty in that role is an absolute fantasy freak. So he's 31. He's obviously had some issues over the years and he's missed a lot of footy. So I actually think that holds him in good stead at 31 to maybe play a few extra years at that high-end level. So keep an eye on what his role's going to be, but, adding him to your side and the potential for him to pick up defender status is very appealing. Number 15 is a guy who debuted last year, and I got really excited about this kid because I heard about 12 months someone compare him to Errol Goulden. I'm talking about Caleb Windsor at Melbourne. Had a great debut year, averaged 59. He's 19, entering his second year. Last year he was predominantly off a wing, but I'm hearing things about him maybe training off half-back. Another guy you wouldn't have on your field, but if he picked up defender status in his second year, that'd be super handy. All right, we've reached the halfway point of the midfielder rankings, and I hope you're enjoying them so far. I thought I'd just hit pause for a moment to talk about the brand new draft platform which has arrived for season 2025. Keeper Fantasy is the all-new platform for your keeper league and single season drafts. The creator is the same brains that brought you Ultimate Footy back in the day, the great Ryan Power. This platform comes with a heap of customization options, a very simple and easy to use interface, plus a stack of other features. I've taken all the keeper and single season drafts I play in and am the commissioner of across and can't wait to get drafting. We are spoilt for choice this year. There's a lot of great drafting platforms available. But I think the big thing that sets Keeper Fantasy apart is the individual player fantasy outlooks on every single player in the league. Does anyone remember the prospectus that Champion Data used to release every year? It had a little fantasy blurb on every single player from Freako, and it was just invaluable in pre-season. Now we have a similar feature, but it's right there on your app, available to you as you draft. So when you get to the later picks and you're throwing darts, you don't have to throw your darts blindfolded anymore. There's info right there for you at the click of a button. Check it out at keeperfantasy.com. Download the app. You're going to love drafting even more than you already do. Let's get back to the rankings. Number 16, we've got Elijah Sardis from Essendon. A lot of hype around this kid when he was drafted at pick 5 in 2022. But thanks to mostly injuries, we've barely seen him play. He's had a handful of games at the end of 2024 and even 2023, but last year he was just the sub. We saw a little bit. We really don't know what we're going to get just yet, but the hype is still there and he's been training well in pre-season, and I think this is the year we're going to see more of him. And he's like a lot of guys who've been hyped up. People draft him when they're drafted in keepers and then get a little frustrated, let him go. So if he's there, I still think there's a lot of value in him. Number 17, we've got Massimo D'Ambrosio from Hawthorn. Came across from Essendon 12 months ago and had a huge season at the Hawks. He was a revelation really for them. Playing on a wing, averaged 78 at only 21 years of age. He's a really excitable player for the future. He's another guy who lost DPP, but playing on a wing, he's going to be able to score. I don't see any reason why his scores would go down in the future. He could only go up from here. So he's a very good one to have. Number 18, we've got Jeremy Sharp from Freo. He came across from Gold Coast and really played a great season at the Dockers. Again, playing mostly off a wing. Only averaged 73. Had some really low scoring games that obviously affected his average, but overall, he's a decent winger, he's a decent scorer, and he's got a ceiling. And at only 23 years old, he'd definitely be worth a spot, maybe as one of your last mid spots. Number 19, we have another veteran in Dylan Shield for the Bombers. He averaged 77 when he did play last year. He's 31, and he's quite similar to Doherty in that I didn't really have too much interest in him until I heard that he'd been training off half back and they could give him that role this year. And that would obviously be quite fruitful for his scoring. And once again, he could be a guy that picks up DPP. So not a bad option even at his age and with his injury history. Number 20, we have Jack Bowes from Geelong. I can't really work this guy out. This will be his third year since coming across from Gold Coast. So his third year at the Cats. And across his first 2 years with them, he's played midfield, he's played off half back. Every time he's kind of looked like he's getting going, then he'll be the sub next week. I really don't know what they're doing with him. He's 26, so he's in the prime of his career. Last year, his average was 79, which isn't too bad. But actually, if you look at games where he wasn't the sub, he averaged 87, which is pretty good. So look, with those numbers, I probably should have had him much higher on this list, but until I really know what Geelong's plan is with him, it's hard to sort of dive in too confidently. Having said that, definitely worth grabbing him, getting him in your side as depth, because if he ever gets a consistent role, he is someone that can score really well in fantasy. Number 21 is a somewhat forgotten man at Richmond. That's Jack Ross. He's 24 now, so he's been around for a while. I feel like at the end of 2023, he was really building, and we were going to get a really good idea of what sort of fantasy guy he was going to be, but injuries cost him the opportunity in 2024, especially when Taranto went down. Potentially there would have been a spot for him to go on the inside, having really just been a wing guy up until then. I still hold out hope with Ross, and I think if he gets a chance this year, particularly with those young guys they've brought in, I mean, it's such a young midfield now. You've got Taranto, Hopper, and then obviously Prestia, who, when he's fit, is there. But apart from that, they've got a huge crop of young guys. And Jack Ross, he's just not that young anymore, so he could be a really important guy in helping develop the young guys. Look, it's a late flyer, really. I wouldn't have him on my field, that's for sure. But if he's there late and you can grab him, I would. Number 22, I've got Marcus Windhager for St Kilda. He averaged 70 last year in his third year, and he could be quite a smart pick, actually, because he's another guy that's lost DPP. But if you look at the St Kilda midfield, they've got McRae coming in, and obviously Jack Steele's still the main man, but Windhager's had a lot of centre bounce exposure in his young career. He's done a fair few tagging roles as well. I wonder if at some stage he's released from that and he can just be a pure ball winner. Entering his fourth year, we could see a jump in his average if he keeps up the CBAs. I think he could be really good, whether it's this year or down the track. Number 23, Justin McInerney for Sydney. He had a great year at the Swans, playing on the wing. He lost his forward status, which makes him a lot less appealing for 2025. But you know what? Coming off an average of 79, and he's 24, he could still grow into a higher average than that, even as a winger. And there's going to be some change, you'd think, at Sydney this year with the new coach. So who knows where he ends up and what sort of role he has. And he can certainly score pretty well. So I think you could do a lot worse for one of your last mids or maybe first bench option. Number 24, we've got a young Tiger midfielder, Kane McAuliffe. Only 19 years old, heading into his second season. We saw bits and pieces of him in 2024 and he looked okay. He's only going to get better and he's only going to get more opportunities, particularly with Richmond being in the position they are in terms of blooding youth. I did see he's put on a bit of size, McAuliffe, really beefed up. That's only going to help him as a 19-year-old. So he's a stash guy. Wouldn't have him anywhere near your field for now, but I can see him being a pretty decent scorer in the future. Number 25 is a guy that Crows fans were screaming out to see last year, and we finally got a good look at Billy Dowling. So he lost DPP. He's a mid only now. His average was 68. He's 20 years old. Look, he looks really good. He looks really good. I do feel like it's probably a bit early in his career to be getting too excited from a fantasy sense. But he did show in the few games he played that he's got a fantasy game. I mean, he started, in his debut, he scored 89. I think there was another 80 a bit later, playing mostly wing off the flanks. I just think with the Crows, there's a lot of young talent and they've brought in some pretty experienced guys. So, yeah, with that, it's going to be hard to see Dowling getting regular games, but he's a very good option for the future. I just don't know if this is the year. Definitely worth a stash because I think he's going to be a fantasy gun in the future. Number 26, speaking of fantasy guns, the pig himself, Tom Mitchell from Collingwood. He's 31, coming off an average of 78. And look, the reason he's so late in these rankings is a couple of things. Obviously, he's had an injury again to start this preseason. So I'm not sure what his return is looking like. But even when he was fit at Collingwood, the last couple of years, they've just used him a lot more sparingly. So he still scores when he's around the ball because it's Tom Mitchell. But there were games, as an owner, where he'd be looking okay and then he'd just be subbed off just for tactical reasons or to keep his body fresh. It's just too painful to have that when he's on field for you. So definitely, how can you ignore him if it's one of your last picks and he's still floating around? But certainly his best days are well behind him, and it's a bit sad. Number 27, Angus Sheldrick at Sydney. Now, we didn't see him once in 2024 at AFL level, but if you cast your mind back to 2023, he only played a handful of games, but when he did, he was a fantasy jet. His points per minute were huge, and yeah, I think we all thought, here's the next big thing potentially in the fantasy world. But then he got injured, lost his spot, and then we didn't see him at all last year. Having said that, he's still there. He hasn't sought a trade elsewhere, and he's, he may have tried to, but he's still there. And I think we're going to see him this year at some point. And even though he is mid-only now, he is someone, I'd want a piece of if we get to see him again. Number 28, I've got Jai Clark for Geelong. 20-year-old, entering his third year. Lots of talk about him since he's been drafted. I think because he was a pretty popular cash cow in the classic formats, some were a little bit disappointed and underwhelmed by his scoring last year. But you've got to remember, that was his second year, and he only played once in his first year. And if you remember that game, this is the reason I've never forgotten this kid. So his debut was in 2023, and he came into the side as the sub. And I can't remember who they were playing, but it was kind of close at three-quarter time. At three-quarter time, Chris Scott said to him, "You're on," took the sub vest off, put him into the game, and he started at the very first centre bounce in that last quarter. And I just thought, they like this kid. They think he's going to be something. And he was actually really good in that one quarter. Unfortunately, he got injured, and we didn't see him again until last year. Anyway, he's not for on the field just yet, but I think they're going to persist with him as a midfielder. Bailey Smith comes in, which is going to take up some of that, that point share. But yeah, don't be surprised if we see a bit of a spike for Clark this year, and definitely grab him and stash him because he's going to be something down the future at least. Number 29 is another guy who's had a fair bit of hype and just hasn't been able to do much in his career so far. That's Will Phillips for North Melbourne. And he's another one of these guys that I reckon keeper coaches would have been frustrated with, maybe took the punt on him earlier in his career when he first arrived and just hasn't got going for a variety of reasons. But I don't know. He's only 22, and I think last year was a big year for him because he found a bit of a role as a run-with guy at times, just to give him something to stand out, because North have got so many great young midfielders. I won't give up on him just yet. He's a late flyer for sure. Chuck him in, see how he goes. This could be the year for him. You never know. And number 30, lucky last, Sam Berry from Adelaide. He's such an interesting guy. He had this year a couple of years ago when he had forward status, and he actually led the AFL for tackles, and he averaged 84. And at that point I thought, here we go, and I was all in on him. And since then he's been in and out of the side as the Crows have tried to work out the right mix. See, the thing with Berry is he's quite similar to what the Crows have already had there in Matt Crouch, Rory Laird. And now the Crows are bringing in really different types of players, and we're going to see more of Rankin in there. I don't know where Berry fits in, but I do know there's something special about him, and I'm biased because I'm a really big fan of his. But when I watch him, he looks like a guy that could be a really, really good footballer. So I think if he's there, he's only 22 as well. If he's there, grab him, put him away and just wait and see what happens with that Crows midfield, because he might just surprise you. And that's my 30. Whew, big list this week. And I'm hoping that it's been helpful for you and you've been able to just think about a player or two that maybe you hadn't been thinking about before. Now, at the start of the podcast, I did talk about 5 players who averaged under 80 last year, but weren't included in my rankings, purely because I don't believe there's a chance that any of these guys will be available in your leagues. But if they are, you better grab them, because I have them ranked higher than any of the guys listed in the 30. Who are they? First guy, I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He only arrived last year. A bit of talk about him out west. Yeah, it's Harley Reid. Absolute future superstar. Only averaged 67, but I think everyone knows what he's going to be, and there's not a chance in any league across the country that he'll be available. And then next we have George Wardlaw from North Melbourne, a young gun mid who has had a pretty serious injury to start this year, so he's going to miss the first chunk of the season. Having said that, though, I'd be staggered if anyone dropped him because of it. So he won't be available, I wouldn't have thought. The other one is Clayton Oliver, one of the best fantasy players we've seen in the last 10 years. Obviously had his issues off field and then with his body, and just averaged 78 last year, but I'm expecting him to bounce back this year and start to score more like the Clayton Oliver we've become accustomed to. The next one is Will Day from Hawthorn. Had a down year last year, only averaging 74, which was well down on the year before, but he's still very young and I think he's a real hot prospect still. And then the last one is Finn Callaghan for GWS. Now, I could hear the argument that he could be available in some leagues, but yeah, I would be surprised. He averaged 77 last year, wasn't quite the breakout maybe coaches were hoping for, but he's still very young as well, and I think he's going to get the keys to that Giants midfield sooner rather than later. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Finders Keepers. I hope you've enjoyed it and really hope these rankings can help you plan for your upcoming redrafts. If you're liking this podcast so far, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening. And you can follow Finders Keepers on X with the handle @FindKeepAFL. Feel free to leave any feedback or thoughts on the show, sort of stuff you want to hear in the future episodes. I love hearing from listeners because that's what's going to help guide and mould this podcast into being exactly what you want it to be. Next week, I will be looking at the ruck line, which is, quite a tricky one. Certainly not as long a list as we've had today. But being able to identify the next up-and-coming ruckman in the league and getting him in your squad, well, that'll give you a huge advantage over the other coaches in your league. So that episode will be out next Monday. Keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.